What did an 83-year-old coyote hunter know about caller placement that the entire electronic call industry has spent decades making sure you never figure out? His name was Vernon Pruitt. He lived outside of Macon County, Tennessee, had hunted coyotes since the 1960s when mouth calls were the only option, and when my buddy introduced us at a feed store on a Thursday afternoon and mentioned I had been struggling to close the distance on circling coyotes, Vernon looked at me for about 4 seconds and said, "You're setting up for what you can see. The dog doesn't care what you can see." That one sentence rearranged everything I thought I knew about this. I had been calling coyotes for 7 years at that point. I owned an electronic caller. I owned a coyote decoy. I had read every forum thread I could find on stand setup and calling sequences and wind management. I was averaging somewhere between 2 and 4 coyotes per night under good conditions on properties I had permission to hunt in northern Alabama. I thought I was doing reasonably well. Vernon came out with me 2 nights later, watched me set up once, and quietly redirected every single decision I made before I ever pressed play on the caller. 18 coyotes in one night across 4 stands. I have not had a night that good before or since, and every single thing that made it different was something an 83-year-old man with a mouth call and a 30-year-old shotgun showed me. We are going to go through the complete system, why your current caller placement is almost certainly wrong, and why it keeps producing circling coyotes that never commit, the specific stand geometry Vernon uses that changes the circling problem into a dead-on approach, how he reads terrain before he ever touches a call, the one calling sequence detail that produces a response in the first 4 minutes or tells you to move, and the conditions under which everything I just described will fail completely so you do not waste nights on the wrong approach. Stay through to the end. There is a wind check timing detail Vernon uses that is the most counterintuitive piece of the entire system, and it is the reason his setup produces committed approaches while most hunters watch the same coyotes circle and disappear into the dark. Before anything else, a note on regulations. Night hunting with lights, thermal optics, and electronic callers is legal in many states and heavily restricted or banned in others. Tennessee, where Vernon hunts, allows it with a hunting license and no special permit. Georgia, Alabama, and most of the Deep South have similar setups. Some states require a depredation permit for night hunting specifically. A few states ban electronic calls for coyotes outright, which surprises people, but it is true. 2 minutes on your state wildlife agency website before you go out keeps you legal. The information in this video applies equally to daytime hunting where night hunting is restricted, and the caller placement logic is the same regardless of when you hunt. The problem with how most coyote hunters set up starts with a flawed assumption about how a coyote investigates a sound source. Most hunters choose their setup location based on where they can cover the most open ground visually, and then they put the electronic caller as close to themselves as possible so the coyote's attention is near where they're shooting. The caller ends up 20 to 40 yards in front of the hunter, which means the caller is the center of the incoming dog's attention, and the hunter is 20 to 40 yards directly behind it. Here's what that setup produces. A coyote hears the call, commits to investigating, and begins working downwind before it commits visually. That is not a failure of the call. That is exactly what a coyote's survival instincts require it to do. A coyote that walks directly into a sound source without circling first is a dead coyote. They know this the same way they know everything else, through generational pressure from things that have tried to kill them. So the dog swings wide, comes around to a position downwind of the caller, and winds the hunter, who is sitting directly behind the caller at 30 yards. The dog disappears. The hunter says the coyote spooked for no reason. The reason was the hunter's position relative to the caller. Vernon's first question when I described my standard setup was how far the caller was from my position. I said 25 yards out in front. He shook his head and said, "You're putting yourself on the dinner plate right next to the food." What he meant was that a coyote circling to verify the sound source needs to wind the caller, not the hunter. If the caller and the hunter are within 40 yards of each other, any approach angle that gives the dog a shot at the caller's scent also gives it the hunter's scent. The solution is distance between the caller and the shooter. Vernon's standard setup places the electronic caller 150 to 200 yards from his position. 150 yards is roughly a block and a half in a city, or the distance from home plate to the wall in center field on a standard baseball diamond. At 150 yards of separation, a coyote circling downwind of the caller has to pass well in front of Vernon's position before it ever reaches the scent cone off the caller. The dog is working toward the call, and Vernon is positioned so that the natural downwind circle puts the coyote broadside in front of him rather than behind or beside him. I had read about extended collar placement before, but I had always assumed the practical problem was that you couldn't watch the collar and your shooting lanes simultaneously. Vernon's answer to that was simple. You are not watching the collar. You are watching the terrain between the collar and your position, because that is where the dog will be when you have a shot. The collar is doing its job 150 yards away. Your job is to cover the ground in front of you. The second piece of this is wind, but not in the way most hunters think about it. Standard advice is to set up with the wind in your face so your scent blows away from the area you're calling into. That is correct as far as it goes. Vernon goes further. He identifies not just the wind direction but the specific topographic feature that is channeling the wind in that exact location on that exact night, because terrain changes what wind does at the ground level in ways that a simple compass bearing does not capture. A ridgetop with wind coming from the north does not have the same ground-level wind pattern as a hollow 200 yards from that ridgetop with wind nominally coming from the same direction. Cold air settles into low ground. A thermal inversion on a clear night will send scent rolling downhill regardless of what the wind is doing at 10 feet off the ground. Vernon's wind check is done at ankle level, not chest level, which is where most hunters test it. He uses a small squeeze bottle of talc powder, holds it at knee height, roughly 18 inches off the ground, and watches where the powder goes. The answer is often different from what a chest height check produces, especially in the first 2 hours after sunset when thermals are still stabilizing. I checked my wind wrong for 7 years. I knew enough to check it. I was checking it at the wrong height and getting partially incorrect information, and then wondering why positioned coyotes were winding me despite my wind precautions. Check your state regulations on powder-based wind indicators if you are hunting near agricultural land with specific pesticide or chemical sensitivity zones. Most areas have no restriction, but it is worth a 5-second check. The third component is what Vernon calls reading the approach. Before he ever sets a stand, he looks at the terrain from the coyote's perspective. A coyote investigating a distress call wants to approach from a position of cover if possible, with the wind favorable, and with an escape route available. It is not just circling randomly. It is using the terrain to give itself the best possible chance of verifying the food source while maintaining the option to leave quickly. Vernon identifies where that approach will most likely come from based on the cover structure and terrain features, and then positions himself to intercept that approach rather than sitting in the open waiting for a coyote to materialize. On rolling hardwood terrain in Tennessee, that typically means the dog is going to come up a drainage or along a cover edge rather than across open ground. He sets up on the downwind side of that expected approach corridor, with his collar placed at the end of the corridor where the dog's nose is pointed. He described it once as setting a table. The collar is the table. His position is the door. He is not sitting at the table because you do not want to eat with your food. He is sitting at the door because everything that comes to eat has to pass through the door. I tried explaining this to a buddy who has been calling coyotes for 15 years, and he told me it was overthinking it. He has a running average of about 2 to 3 dogs per night on good nights. I am not going to tell him he is wrong. I will say that the night I watched Vernon work, the geometry was so deliberate and so different from anything I had done before that it looked like a different activity from the same sport. On that same note, here's what Vernon's system does not do. It does not save bad wind nights. If the thermal situation is chaotic, meaning the air is swirling or reversing direction at unpredictable intervals as it sometimes does in the first hour after a front passes, Vernon packs up and goes home. He has been doing this long enough to know that a confused wind produces confused results and that there is no collar placement geometry that compensates for scent going in 3 directions simultaneously. He told me that the nights you decide not to hunt are sometimes the best decisions you make in a season. The system also works very poorly on properties that have been called heavily and recently. A coyote that has been called at multiple times has learned to associate distress sounds with a specific sequence of events: sound, circling investigation, danger. An educated coyote will often hang at 300 to 400 yards, roughly 3 to 4 football fields out, and watch without committing, even on a perfect wind setup. Vernon's response to suspected education is to drop distress calls entirely for that stand and run only coyote vocalizations, specifically a female invitation howl followed by a long silence. He says that an educated coyote that has learned to avoid distress sounds has often not learned to avoid social calls because hunters use social calls less frequently. That was a new piece for me, and I have applied it with some success on pressured coyotes in northern Alabama since. On heavily pressured public land, I want to be direct about what this system delivers. You will get fewer coyotes than on private land regardless of how good your setup is, because the animals that survive on public ground are survivors by definition. Vernon hunts private land exclusively. He has relationships with 4 or 5 landowners going back 30 years, and those relationships produce access to ground where coyotes have not been called repeatedly. If you are hunting pressured public ground, the geometry principles still apply, but your expectations should be calibrated accordingly. A quick note on night vision and thermal. Vernon runs neither. He runs a red-filtered spotlight and has been doing it since before thermal optics existed. Red light does not affect a coyote's vision the way white light does, which is why predator hunters have used it for generations. Modern thermal obviously produces better results at range and in dense cover, and if you have access to thermal gear and hunt in a state where it is legal for coyotes at night, it is a genuine improvement over red light on distance and in complex terrain. Vernon's results without it suggest that the setup geometry matters more than the optics technology, but thermal removes variables that matter at the margin. Electronic collars vary significantly in quality and feature set. Vernon's preferred collar for the last decade has been a Fox Pro model, specifically for its wireless remote range and the quality of its internal library. Lucky Duck collars run a close second and are meaningfully less expensive. The feature that matters most to Vernon is remote trigger distance, because the longer he can place the collar from his position and still control it, the more effectively he can create the separation geometry we have been discussing. He runs his collar on full extension, which on his Fox Pro is 200 yards, roughly 2 full football fields on flat ground, in timber that drops to around 150 yards before signal reliability becomes an issue with his specific unit. The calling sequence Vernon uses is different from most of what I had read online. Most resources suggest starting with a high-volume, high-excitement, distress sound to pull a dog from distance, then transitioning to softer, more realistic sounds as the dog closes. Vernon reverses this on the opener. He starts at medium volume with a cottontail in distress at a realistic level, not max volume, and holds it for 3 minutes. 3 minutes is about the length of 2 average pop songs, which gives you a reference for how long it actually is when you are sitting in the dark watching nothing happen. He is listening for a response during that first 3 minutes, not movement, sound, a bark, a yip, a distant howl. Any coyote within hearing range that is going to respond will usually give you an auditory indication within the first 2 to 3 minutes. If he gets a vocal response, he goes quiet. Completely quiet. He kills the caller and watches. The responding dog has now told him where it is, and he waits for it to close the distance on its own without giving it any additional sound to work with. He described this as turning off the music when the guest is already on the way. The coyote heard what it needed to hear. More sound now only gives it more information to triangulate against. If there is no response in 3 minutes, he bumps volume slightly and runs a different sound for 2 more minutes. Puppy distress is his second sequence because it produces a different biological trigger from cottontail distress. Where cottontail distress activates predator feeding drive, puppy distress activates social disruption response, which draws coyotes that might ignore a food call but cannot ignore the sound of a coyote pup in trouble. The 2 calls are drawing on different behavioral mechanisms, and a dog that ignores one sometimes cannot ignore the other. Think about that for a second. 2 different biological triggers on the same stand run in sequence, targeting different motivational systems in the same animal. I had been running variations of the same distress sound for the same 5-minute duration on every stand and wondering why some nights nothing came in. The animal was not the variable. The behavioral trigger I was hitting was the variable. The wind check timing piece I mentioned in the bridge is this. Most hunters check wind before they set up, which is correct. Vernon checks wind again at 20-minute intervals during the stand, specifically because thermal patterns on clear, calm nights shift as ground temperature drops. What was a favorable southeast wind at 9 p.m. may have become a swirling thermal reversal by 10 p.m. as cold air settles into the hollow. Vernon kills the caller, checks wind at ankle level again, and either continues or repositions. On the night with 18 coyotes, he repositioned twice after thermal shifts, which means he essentially ran 6 stands rather than 4 by subdividing 2 of them when the thermal situation changed. That kind of attentiveness to changing conditions mid-stand is rare. Most hunters commit to a setup and ride it out. Vernon's willingness to break down, move 100 yards, reset, and start again is part of why his total is what it is. It is also more work than most hunters want to do in the dark. That is an honest statement. The gear side of this is not complicated. Vernon's shotgun is a Mossberg 512 gauge that he has owned since the 1980s. He runs Winchester buckshot loads at close range and a Savage bolt rifle in .223 when he wants range. The .223 is a common and effective Coyote cartridge that works well on fur bearers when pelt condition matters and is sufficient for predator control situations when it does not. A Bushnell red dot runs on the shotgun and a Leupold VX3i runs on the .223. Neither is high-end relative to what the market offers. Neither is the reason he kills coyotes. I will close on something he said the second night we hunted together after the third stand had produced 2 dogs and we were resetting toward a cedar draw on the backside of a ridge. He said that the reason most hunters go home empty-handed is not that coyotes are smart. It is that hunters give coyotes information they should not have. Every time a coyote winds a hunter, or hears a truck door at 400 yards, or sees movement on a silhouetted ridgeline, or watches a hunter walk across an open field to a stand position, the hunter has handed the dog information it will remember. The stands that produce are the ones where the hunter gives away nothing. The geometry, the wind check, the approach route, the caller distance, the silence after the first response. All of it is just reducing the information the coyote receives that it should not have. An 83-year-old man with a Mossberg he bought used in 1982 outperformed everything I had read on the internet because he understood that the game is not about what you bring to the field. It is about how little you give away when you are there. Pick one piece of this and apply it on your next stand. Start with the caller distance, if nothing else. Move it to 100 yards from your position rather than 30, and watch what the circling problem does. One change, one night, and let the dog tell you whether it makes a difference.